The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant. Copyright 1944 by Will Durant. Copyright renewed 1971 by Will Durant. This recording of the full-length reading of Caesar and Christ was published by arrangement with Monica Ariel Mahel, Trustee Ethel B. Durant Trust, Monica Ariel Mahel, and William James Durant Easton, and was produced in 1994 by Books on Tape Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any part thereof may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authority from Books on Tape Incorporated. This book is read by Alexander Adams. Caesar and Christ, Part 2, by Will Durant. This book consists of 15 chapters and is 334 pages long. Chapter 16, Rome and its Art, 30 B.C. to A.D. 96. 1. The Debt to Greece. The Romans were not of themselves an artistic people. Before Augustus they were warriors, after him they were rulers. They counted the establishment of order and security through government a greater good and nobler task than the creation or enjoyment of beauty. They paid great sums for the works of dead masters, but looked down upon living artists as menials. While we adore images, said the kindly Seneca, we despise those who fashion them. Only law and politics, and of manual arts only agriculture, by proxy, seemed honorable ways of life. Barring the architects, most artists in Rome were Greek slaves or freedmen or hirelings. Nearly all worked with their hands and were classed as artisans. Latin authors seldom thought of recording their lives or their names. Hence Roman art is almost wholly anonymous. No vivid personalities humanize its history as Myron, Phidias, Praxiteles, and Protogenes light up the aesthetic story of Greece. Here the historian is constrained to speak of things, not men, to catalogue coins, vases, statues, reliefs, pictures, and buildings, in the desperate hope that their accumulation may laboriously convey the crowded majesty of Rome. The products of art appeal to the soul through eye or ear or hand rather than through the intellect. Their beauty fades when it is diluted into ideas and words. The universe of thought is only one of many worlds. Each sense has its own. Each art has therefore its own characteristic medium, which cannot be translated into speech. Even an artist writes about art in vain. A special misfortune clouds Roman art. We come to it from Greek art, which seems at first its model and master. As the art of India disturbs us by strange shapes, so that of Rome chills us by the monotonous repetition of familiar forms. We have seen long since these Doric, Ionic, Corinthian columns and capitals, these smooth, idealized reliefs, these busts of poets, rulers, and gods. Even the astonishing frescoes of Pompeii, we are told, were copies of Greek originals. Only the composite order is indigenously Roman, and it offends our notions of classic unity, simplicity, and restraint. Certainly, the art of the Augustan age in Rome was overwhelmingly Greek. Through Sicily and Greek Italy, through Campania and Etruria, finally through Greece, Alexandria, and the Hellenic East, the aesthetic forms, methods, and ideals of Hellas passed into Roman art. When Rome became mistress of the Mediterranean, Greek artists poured into the new center of wealth and patronage and made countless copies of Greek masterpieces for Roman temples, palaces, and squares. Every conqueror brought home examples, every magnate scoured the cities for the surviving treasures of Greek workmanship. Gradually, Italy became a museum of bought or stolen paintings and statuary that set the tone of Roman art for a century. Artistically, Rome was swallowed up in the Hellenistic world. All this is half the truth. In one aspect, as we shall see, the history of Roman art is a conflict between the architrave and the arch. In another, it is the struggle of native Italian realism to recover from the invasion of the peninsula by a Greek art that had pictured gods rather than men, the type or Platonic idea rather than the earthly individual, and had sought a noble perfection of form rather than truth of perception and utterance. That virile indigenous art which had helped to carve the figures on Etruscan tombs hibernated between the Greek conquest and Nero's Philhellenic ecstasy. But at last it broke the Hellenistic mold and revolutionized classic art with realistic sculpture, impressionistic painting, and an architecture of arch and vault. Through these, as well as by her borrowed beauty, Rome became for 18 centuries the art capital of the Western world. 2. The toiler's Rome. The ancient traveler bent on making a tour of Flavian Rome and coming northward up the Tiber from Ostia would first of all have noted the swiftness of the muddy current, carrying along the soil of hills and valleys to the sea. In this simple fact lay the leisurely tragedy of erosion, the difficulty of two-way commerce on the river, the periodical silting of the Tiber's mouth, and the floods that almost every spring inundated the lower levels of Rome, confined the residents to upper stories reached by boats, and often destroyed the corn stored in granaries on the wharves. When the waters fell, they carried houses to ruin and men and animals to death. As he neared the city, the visitor's eye would be caught by the Emporium, which ran for 1,000 feet along the river's eastern edge and was noisy with workers, warehouses, markets, and moving goods. Beyond it rose that Aventine hill on which the angry plebs had staged its sit-down strikes of 494 and 449 B.C. On the left bank at this point were the gardens that Caesar had bequeathed to the people, and behind them the Janiculum. Near the eastern shore at the beautiful Pons Aemilius lay the Forum Boarium, or cattle market, with its still standing temples to Fortune and Mater Matuta, the goddess of the dawn. Farther north on the right loomed the Palatine and Capitoline hills, thick with palaces and temples. On the left bank were Agrippa's gardens, and beyond them the Vatican Hill. North of the city's center, off the eastern shore, stretched the spacious lawns and decorative buildings of the Campus Martius, or Field of Mars. Here were the theaters of Balbus and Pompey, the circus of Flaminius, the baths of Agrippa, and Domitian's stadium. Here the legions practiced, athletes competed, chariots raced, the people played ball, and the assembly gathered, under the emperors, to go through the motions of democracy's ghost. Disembarking at the city's northern limits, the visitor saw some remains of the wall ascribed to Servius Tullius. Rome had probably rebuilt it after the Gallic raid of 390 B.C., but the power of Roman arms and the apparent security of the capital allowed the rampart to lapse into ruins. Not till Aurelian, or A.D. 270, would another wall rise, a symbol of security gone. Gates had been cut in the wall, usually as single or triple archways, to permit the passage of the great roads from which they took their names. Touring the boundary of the city east and then south, the visitor would see the luxuriant gardens of Sallust, the dusty camp of the Praetorians, the arches of the Martian, Appian, and Claudian aqueducts, and on his right in turn the Pincian, Quirinal, Viminal, Esquiline, and Celian hills. Leaving the walls and walking northwest on the Appian Way, he would pass through the Porta Capena, along the southern slope of the Palatine to the Nova Via, or New Street, and then northward through a maze of arches and buildings to stand in the ancient Forum, the head and heart of Rome. Originally, it had been a marketplace, some 600 by 200 feet. Now, in A.D. 96, the sellers had retired into the nearby streets or into other forums, but in the adjoining basilicas men sold shares in the publicans' corporations, made contracts with the government, defended themselves in the courts, or consulted lawyers on how to escape the law. Around the Forum had been built, as around New York's Wall Street, some modest temples to the gods, and some larger ones to Mammon. A population of statues adorned it, and the colonnades of great edifices provided the shade that could hardly come from a few ancient trees. From 145 B.C. till Caesar, it had been the meeting place of the assemblies. At either end stood a speaker's platform, named rostrum because an earlier stand had been decorated with the rostra, or prows of ships captured from Antium in 338 B.C. At the western end was the millenarium aureum, or golden milestone, a column of gilded bronze set up by Augustus to mark the junction and origin of several consular roads. On it were inscribed the major towns reached and their distances from Rome. Along the southwest side ran the Sacra Via, or Sacred Way, which led up to the temples of Jupiter and Saturn on the Capitoline Hill. North of this forum, the visitor would find a larger one, the Forum Iulium, built by Caesar to relieve the older area. Nearby were additional forums laid out for Augustus and Vespasian, and soon Trajan would clear and adorn the greatest of them all. Even in so hasty a circuit, the ancient tourist would have felt the crowded diversity of the city's population, and the tortuous inadequacy of its haphazard streets. A few of these were from 16 to 19 feet wide. Most of them were meandering alleys in the Oriental style. Juvenal complained that carts rumbling over the uneven pavements at night made sleep impossible, while the jostling crowds made daytime walking a form of war. Hurry as we may, we are blocked by a surging host in front and by a dense mass of people pressing upon us from behind. One digs an elbow into me, another a sedan pole. One bangs a beam, another a wine cask against my head. My legs are beplastered with mud. Huge feet trample upon me from every side. A soldier plants his hobnailed boot squarely upon my toes. The main thoroughfares were paved with large pentagonal blocks of lava stone, sometimes so firmly set in concrete that a few have remained in place till our time. There was no street lighting. Whoever ventured out after dark carried a lantern or followed a torch-bearing slave. In either case he ran the gauntlet of many thieves. Doors were fastened with locks and keys, windows were bolted at night, and those on the ground floor were guarded as now by iron bars. To these perils Juvenal adds the objects, solid or liquid, thrown from upper-floor windows. All in all, he thought only a fool would go out to dinner without making his will. Since there were no public vehicles to transport workers from their homes to their toil, most of the plebs lived in brick tenements near the heart of the town, or in rooms behind or above their shops. A tenement usually covered an entire square and was therefore called an insula, or island. Many of these buildings were 6 or 7 stories high, and so flimsily built that several collapsed, killing hundreds of occupants. Augustus limited the frontal height of buildings to 70 Roman feet, but apparently the law permitted greater elevations in the rear, for Martial tells of a poor devil whose attic is 200 steps up. Many tenements had shops on the ground floor, some had balconies on the second. A few were connected at the top with tenements across the street by arched passages containing additional rooms, precarious penthouses for particular plebeians. Such insulae almost filled the Nova Via, the Clivus Victoriae, or Victory Hill, on the Palatine, and the Subura, a noisy brothel-ridden district between the Viminal and the Esquiline. In them dwelt the longshoremen of the Emporium, the butchers of the Macellum, the fishmongers of the Forum Piscatorium, the cattlemen of the Forum Boarium, the vegetable vendors of the Forum Holatorium, and the workers in Rome's factories, clerkships, and trades. The slums of Rome lapped the edges of the Forum. The streets off the Forum were lined with shops and resounded with labor and bargaining. Fruit sellers, booksellers, perfumers, milliners, dyers, florists, cutlers, locksmiths, apothecaries, and other caterers to the needs, foibles, and vanities of mankind blocked the thoroughfares with their projecting booths. Barbers plied their trade in the open air, where all could hear. Wine taverns were so numerous that Rome seemed to Martial one vast saloon. Each trade tended to center on some quarter or street and often gave the locality a name. So the sandal makers were gathered in the Vicus Sandalarius, the harness makers in the Vicus Lorarius, the glass blowers in the Vicus Vitrarius, the jewelers in the Vicus Margaritarius. In such shops, the artists of Italy did their work, all but the greatest of them, who drew high fees and lived in peripatetic luxury. Lucullus gave Arcesilaus 1,000,000 sesterces to make a statue of the goddess Felicitas, and Zenodorus received 400,000 for a Colossus of Mercury. Architects and sculptors were ranked with physicians, teachers, and chemists as pursuing artes liberales, arts of freemen. But the men who did most of the artwork of Rome were, or had been, slaves. Some owners had their bondsmen trained in carving, painting, and like skills, and sold their products in Italy and abroad. In such shops labor was sharply divided. Some specialized in votive figures, others in decorative cornices. Some cut glass eyes for statues. Different painters made arabesques or flowers or landscapes or animals or men, and worked in turn on the same picture. Several artists were expert forgers, producing antiques of any marketable age. The Romans of the last century B.C. were easily deceived in these matters, for like most nouveau riches, they tended to value objects according to cost and rarity rather than by beauty and use. During the Empire, when it was no longer a distinction to be wealthy, taste improved, and a sincere love of excellence brought to many thousands of families a refinement of utensils and ornaments, such as only a very few had known in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece. Art was to antiquity what industry is to modernity. Men could not then enjoy the lavish abundance of useful products now poured forth by our machines, but they could, if they cared enough, gradually surround themselves with objects whose zealously finished form gave to all who lived with them the subtle and quiet happiness of beautiful things. 3. The homes of the great. The visitor seeking to study the dwellings of the middle class would have found them away from the city's center on the main diverging roads. Their brick and stucco exteriors were still built as before in the plain and solid style dictated by insecurity and heat. The Roman bourgeois wasted no art on passers-by. Few houses rose to more than 2 stories. Cellars were rare, roofs sparkled with red tiles, windows were fitted with shutters or, occasionally, panes of glass. The entrance was usually a double door, each half turning on metal pivots. Floors were of concrete or tile, often of mosaic squares. There were no carpets. Around the central atrium were grouped the main rooms of the house. This is the architectural origin of the cloister and the college quadrangle. In the richer houses, 1 or more rooms would be used for bathing, usually in tubs, much like our own. Plumbing was carried by the Romans to an excellence unmatched before the 20th century. Lead pipes brought water from the aqueducts and mains into most tenements and homes. Fittings and stopcocks were of bronze, and some were molded into highly ornamental designs. Leaders and gutters of lead carried rain from the roof. Most rooms were heated, if at all, by portable charcoal braziers. A few homes, many villas and palaces, and the public baths enjoyed central heating from wood or charcoal-burning furnaces, supplying hot air to various rooms through tile pipes or passages in floors and walls. In the early empire, a Hellenistic addition was made to the rich Roman's house. To provide a privacy not always possible in the atrium, he built behind it a peristylium, a court open to the sky, planted with flowers and shrubs, adorned by statues, surrounded by a portico, and centering about a fountain or a bathing pool. Around this court he raised a new set of rooms, a triclinium, or dining room, an oecus, or house, for the women, a pinacoteca for his art collection, a biblioteca for his books, and a lararium for his household gods. There might also be extra bedrooms and little alcoves called exedrae, sitting-out nooks. Less expensive homes substituted a garden for the peristylium, and if even that could find no ground, the Romans placed flower boxes in the windows or grew flowers and shrubs on the roof. Some large roofs, says Seneca, had grape arbors, fruit trees, and shade trees planted in boxes of soil. Not a few had solaria for baking bellies in the sun. Many Romans wearied of the roar and rush of Rome and fled to the peace and boredom of the countryside. Rich and poor alike developed a feeling for nature beyond anything discernible in ancient Greece. Juvenal thought a man foolish to live in the capital when, for the annual rental of a dark garret in Rome, he might buy a pretty house in some quiet Italian town and surround it with a trim garden fit to feast 100 Pythagoreans. The well-to-do moved out of Rome in early spring to villas in the foothills of the Apennines, or on the shores of lakes or the sea. The younger Pliny has left us a pleasant description of his country house at Laurentum, on the coast of Latium. He calls it large enough for my convenience without being expensive to maintain, but as he goes on we suspect a pose in his modesty. He describes a small porch sheltered by glazed windows and overhanging eaves, a handsome dining room gently washed by the edge of the last breakers, and so bright with spacious windows as to give a view in 3 directions, as if of 3 different seas. An atrium whence the prospect ends in woods and mountains, 2 drawing rooms, a semicircular library whose windows receive the sun all day long, a bedchamber, and several rooms for servants. In an opposite wing were an elegant parlor, a second dining room, and 4 small rooms, a bathroom suite consisting of a pleasant undressing room, a frigidarium or cold bath, a tepidarium with 3 pools heated at different degrees, and a calidarium or hot bath, all centrally heated by hot air pipes. Outside were a swimming pool, a ball court, a storehouse, a variegated garden, a private study and banquet hall, and an observation tower with 2 apartments and a dining room. Tell me now, Pliny concludes, have I not just cause to bestow my time and affection upon this agreeable retreat? If a senator could have such a villa on the sea and another on Como, we may begin to imagine the sprawling luxury of Tiberius's estate at Capri, or Domitian's at Alba Longa, not to speak of the one that Hadrian would soon build at Tibur. To match this cubicular extravagance, the visitor would have to find entry to the palaces of millionaires and emperors on the Palatine. In domestic architecture, the Romans did not care to imitate classic Greece, where homes were modest and only temples were great. They modeled their palaces upon the residences of the half-orientalized Hellenistic kings. Ptolemaic styles came to Rome with Cleopatra's gold, and royal architecture accompanied monarchical politics. The palace of Augustus, receiving the name from the hill it stood on, spread with extensions as the administrative functions of the imperial household increased. Most of his successors built additional palaces for themselves and their staffs. Tiberius his Domus Tiberiana, Caligula his Domus Gaiana, Nero his Domus Aurea. This golden house became the passing wonder of Rome. Its buildings alone covered 900,000 square feet, and yet were but a small part of a mile-square villa that overflowed from the Palatine upon the neighboring hills. A great park surrounded the palace, with gardens, meadows, fish ponds, game preserves, aviaries, vineyards, streams, fountains, waterfalls, lakes, imperial galleys, pleasure houses, summer houses, flower houses, and porticos 3,000 feet long. An angry wit scratched a representative comment on a wall. Rome has become the habitation of one man. It is time, citizens, to emigrate to Veii, unless, indeed, Veii itself is to be comprised in Nero's home. The interior of the palace gleamed with marble, bronze, and gold, with the gilded metal of countless Corinthian capitals, and with thousands of statues, reliefs, paintings, and objects of art bought or looted from the classic world. Among them was the Laocoon. Some of the walls were inlaid with mother-of-pearl and various costly gems. The ceiling of the banquet hall was covered with ivory flowers, from which, at a nod of the emperor, a perfumed spray would fall upon his guests. The dining room had a spherical ceiling of ivory painted to represent the sky and the stars, which was kept in constant slow rotation by hidden machines. A suite of rooms provided hot baths, cold baths, tepid baths, salt water baths, and sulfur baths. When the Roman architects Celer and Severus had nearly finished the immense structure and Nero moved in, he remarked, "At last I am lodged." A generation later, this Roman Versailles, too costly and dangerous to maintain amid surrounding poverty, had fallen into neglect. Over its ruins, Vespasian built the Colosseum, Titus and Trajan, their enormous public baths. Domitian shared Nero's architectural madness. For him, Rabirius raised the Domus Flavia, not quite as elephantine as Nero's museum, but yielding little to it in gaudy splendor and decoration. One wing alone contained a vast basilica, probably the court where the emperor tried cases of final appeal. The same wing enclosed a peristylium covering 30,000 square feet. Adjoining this was a banquet hall whose pavement of red porphyry and green serpentine survives. Gone are the delicate marble screens and beautifully columned windows through which the diners might watch the waters splashing over the marble basins of the nymphia or fountains outside. It should be added that Domitian used this building only for receptions and administration. Usually he lived in the more modest quarters of Augustus's palace. Doubtless these royal edifices were part of the facade of empire, designed to impress natives, visitors, and embassies, while the emperors themselves, perhaps excepting Caligula and Nero, fled from the constraining formality of these ceremonial rooms to the ease and intimacy of their family quarters, and enjoyed, as Antoninus Pius would put it, the pleasure of being men. 4. The arts of decoration. In these palaces, and in the homes of the rich, 100 arts were employed to make everything, if not beautiful, at least expensive. The floors were often of polychrome marble, or mosaics whose patient combination of tiny vari-colored cubes, or tesserae, resulted in paintings of remarkable realism and permanence. Furniture was less abundant and comfortable than among ourselves, but of generally superior design and workmanship. Tables, chairs, benches, couches, beds, lamps, and utensils were made of lasting materials and lavishly adorned. The best wood, ivory, marble, bronze, silver, and gold were carefully turned and finished, decorated with plant or animal forms, or inlaid with ivory, tortoise shell, chased bronze, or precious stones. Tables were sometimes cut from costly cypress or citrus woods. Some were of gold or silver. Many were of marble or bronze. Chairs were of every sort, from folding stool to throne, but less calculated than ours to deform the spine. Beds were of wood or metal, with slim but sturdy legs often ending in an animal's head or foot. A bronze web, instead of a spring, supported a mattress filled with straw or wool. Bronze tripods of elegant form took the place of our end tables, and here and there were cabinets with pigeonholes for rolled books. Bronze braziers warmed the rooms, and bronze lamps lighted them. Mirrors, too, were of bronze, highly polished, embossed or engraved with floral or mythical designs. Some were made horizontally or vertically convex or concave to distort reflections into a humorous slenderness or rotundity. The factories of Campania, working with the rich output of Spanish mines, produced silverware on a large scale for a wide market. Silver services were now common in the middle and upper classes. In 1895, an excavator found in the cistern of a villa at Bosco Reale a remarkable collection of silver, apparently deposited there by its owner before his unsuccessful flight from the embers of Vesuvius in AD 79. One of the 16 cups bears an almost perfect representation of simple foliage. Two depict skeletons in high relief. Another pictures Augustus enthroned between Venus and Mars, the rival deities of mankind. The slyest shows Zeno the Stoic pointing with scorn at Epicurus, who is helping himself to a huge piece of cake, while a pig, with uplifted foreleg, politely asks for a share. The coins and gems of the early empire prove the progress of the engraver's art. Those of Augustus show the same good taste, sometimes the same designs as the altar of peace. Precious stones imported from Africa, Arabia, and India were cut and set into rings, brooches, necklaces, bracelets, cups, even into walls. A ring on at least one finger was a social necessity. A few fops wore rings on all fingers but one. The Roman sealed his signature with his ring and therefore liked to have the seal individually designed. Some of the best-paid artists in Rome were gem cutters, like the Dioscurides who made Augustus's seal. In cutting cameos, the Golden Age reached a level never surpassed. The Gemma Augusta in Vienna is among the finest in existence. To collect gems and cameos became a hobby of rich Romans: Pompey, Caesar, Augustus. By inheritance, the imperial gem cabinet grew till Marcus Aurelius sold it to help pay for his war against the Marcomanni. From the official guardian of the imperial seals and gems, England derived her keeper of the great or privy seal. Meanwhile, the potters of Capua, Puteoli, Cumae, and Aretium were filling Italian homes with every variety of ceramic art. Aretium had mixing vats with a capacity of 10,000 gallons. Its red-glazed tableware was for a century the most widely spread product of Italy. Specimens of it have been found almost everywhere. Iron stamps, hollowed out in relief, were used to impress upon each vase, lamp, or tile the name of the maker, sometimes also the names of the year's consuls, as a date. To this degree, the ancients knew the art of printing. They left it undeveloped because slave copyists were cheap. From pottery, the workers of Cumae, Liternum, and Aquileia turned to the production of artistic glass. The Portland vase is a famous example of its kind. Finer still is the blue glass vase found at Pompeii, depicting in lively and graceful action a vintage feast of Bacchus. In the reign of Tiberius, say Pliny and Strabo, the art of glass blowing was brought from Sidon or Alexandria to Rome, and soon produced polychrome phials, cups, bowls, and other forms of such delicate beauty that they became for a time the favorite prey of art collectors and millionaires. In Nero's reign, 6,000 sesterces were paid for 2 small cups of blown glass, now known as millefiori, or 1,000 flowers, produced by fusing together different colored glass rods. Even more prized were the murine vases imported from Asia and Africa. They were made by placing white and purple glass filaments side by side to form a desired pattern, and then firing them. Or pieces of colored glass were embedded in a transparent white body. Pompey brought some to Rome after his victory over Mithridates. Augustus, though he melted down Cleopatra's gold plate, kept for himself her goblet of murine glass. Nero paid 1,000,000 sesterces for one such cup. Petronius, dying, broke another lest it should fall into Nero's hands. All in all, the Romans have had no superior in making glass, and there are few art collections in the world more precious than those of Roman glass in the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. 5. Sculpture. Pottery passed into sculpture through baked clay, terracotta reliefs and statuettes, toys, imitations of fruit, grapes, fish, at last full-sized statues. Glazed terracotta, majolica, abounded in the ruins of Pompeii. Temple pediments and eaves were adorned with terracotta palmettes, acroteria, gargoyles, and reliefs. The Greeks laughed at these ornaments, and under the empire they went out of fashion. Augustus was no friend of clay. It was probably through his Attic taste that relief and sculpture attained in Rome an excellence comparable with the best Hellenistic work. For a generation, the artists of Rome carved fountains, tombstones, arches, and altars with the refinement of feeling, a precision of execution, a quiet dignity of form, a measure of modeling and perspective that rank Roman reliefs among the masterpieces of the world's art. In 13 B.C., the Senate celebrated the return of Augustus from the pacification of Spain and Gaul by decreeing that an Ara Pacis Augusti, or altar of the Augustan peace, should be erected in the field of Mars. This is the noblest of all the sculptural remains of Rome. Perhaps the monument owed its form to the altar at Pergamum and its processional motif to the Parthenon frieze. The altar was raised on a platform in an enclosure whose surrounding walls were partly carved in marble relief. The extant pieces are slabs from these walls. One slab represents Tellus, Mother Earth, with 2 children in her arms, corn and flowers growing beside her, and animals lying contentedly at her feet. These were the leading ideas of the Augustan Reformation: the family restored to parentage, the nation to agriculture, the empire to peace. The central figure is unsurpassed. Indeed, in its union of mature motherhood and womanly beauty, tenderness, and grace, there is a soft perfection unmatched by the stately goddesses of the Parthenon. The frieze of the outer wall had a lower panel of acanthus scrolls, broad-petaled peonies and poppies, and rich clusters of ivy berries. This, too, is unequaled in its class. Another panel showed 2 processions moving in opposite directions to meet before the altar of the goddess of peace. In these groups are grave and quiet figures, probably of Augustus, Livia, and the imperial family, with nobles, priests, vestal virgins, and children. These last are engagingly real in their shy innocence. One is a baby toddling along with no taste for ceremony. Another is a boy already proud of his years. Another, a little girl with a nosegay. Another, after some mischief, is being gently admonished by his mother. Henceforth, children would play a rising role in Italian art. But never again would Roman sculpture show such mastery of drapery, such natural and effective grouping, such modulations of light and shade. Here, as in Virgil, propaganda had found a perfect medium. The only Roman rivals of these reliefs are the carvings on the arches raised for the entry of triumphing generals. The finest survivor is the Arch of Titus, begun by Vespasian and completed by Domitian to commemorate the capture of Jerusalem. One relief shows the burning city, its walls in ruins, its people wild with fear, its wealth looted by legionaries. Another pictures Titus riding into Rome in his chariot amid soldiers, animals, magistrates, priests, and prisoners, followed by the holy candelabra of the temple and varied spoils of war. The artists here experimented bravely. They cut different figures to different levels and distributed them on diverse planes. They chiseled the background to give an illusion of depth, and they painted the whole to convey additional shades of fullness and distance. The action was shown not in separate episodes, but in continuity, as on the friezes of Mesopotamia and Egypt, and later on the columns of Trajan and Aurelius. So the sense of motion and life was better conveyed. The figures were not idealized and softened into a mood of Attic repose, as in the Hellenistic Ara Pacis. They were taken from the flesh and the dirt and carved in the earthy tradition of Italian realism and vitality. The subject was not perfect gods, but living men. It is this vigorous realism that distinguishes Roman sculpture from the Greek. But for this recurrent fidelity to their own bent, the Romans would have added little to art. About 90 B.C., a Greek from South Italy, Pisidiles, went to Rome, lived there for 60 years, did excellent work in silver, ivory, and gold, introduced silver mirrors, made skillful copies of Greek masterpieces, and wrote 5 volumes on the history of art. He was both the Vasari and the Cellini of his time. Another Greek, Arcesilaus, made for Caesar a famous statue of his distant relative, Venus Genetrix. Apollonius of Athens, probably in Rome, carved the powerful Torso Belvedere of the Vatican, a work conceived with moderation, proclaiming no bulging muscles, but showing a man in the fullness of health and strength. We can only say of it that it is perfect so far as it goes. For a time, the studios busied themselves giving Greek form to Italian gods, even to divine abstractions like chance and chastity. Presumably, in this period and in Rome, Glycon of Athens carved the Farnese Hercules. We cannot tell to what age or country the Apollo Belvedere belongs. Perhaps it was a Roman copy of an original by Leochares of Athens. Every student knows how its calm beauty stirred Winckelmann to Uranian ecstasy. Juno received now 2 renowned embodiments, the Porphyry Farnese Juno of the Naples Museum and the Ludovisi Juno of the Terme. Cold and stern, righteous and just, one begins to understand Jove's wanderings. All these, and the graceful Perseus and Andromeda of the Capitoline Museum, were in the Greek style, idealized and generalized, and tiresomely divine. More arresting are the portrait busts that constitute a bronze and marble dictionary of Roman physiognomy from Pompey to Constantine. Some of these, too, are idealized, particularly the Julio-Claudian heads, but the old Etruscan realism and the ever-present example of unflattering death masks reconciled the Romans to being represented as ugly, provided they were shown as strong. So many of them bequeathed their effigies to public places that at times Rome seemed to belong less to the quick than to the dead. Some worthies could not bide their end, but erected themselves as statues before their death, until the jealous emperors, to make room for the living, forbade such premature immortality. The greatest of the portrait busts is the so-named head of Caesar, of black basalt, in Berlin. We do not know whom it represents, but the sparse hair and sharp chin, the thin and bony face, the heavy lines of weary thought, the resolution yielding to disillusionment, accord well with the traditional attribution. Only second to it is the colossal head of Caesar in Naples. Here the wrinkles have set almost into bitterness, as if the giant had at last discovered that no mind is broad enough to understand, much less to rule the world. Realistic to repulsiveness is the Pompey of the Ny Carlsberg Glyptothek in Copenhagen, all the brave triumphs of his youth forgotten in the dull obesity of a beaten man. Of Augustus we have 100 statues, many of them masterly. Augustus the boy, in the Vatican, serious, keen, noble, the finest portrait of an actual youth in any age. Augustus at 30 in the British Museum, a bronze figure of burning determination, reminding us of Suetonius's statement that the emperor could quell a mutiny with a glance. Augustus the priest in the Thermae, a profound and pensive face emerging from a prison of drapery, and Augustus Imperator, found in the ruins of Livia's villa at Prima Porta, and now in the Vatican. The breastplate of this famous figure is covered with esoteric and distracting reliefs. The pose is stiff, the legs are too mighty for such an invalid, but the head has a quiet and self-confident power that reveals the hand and soul of a great artist, who could not quite forget the Doryphoros of Polyclitus. Livia herself was fortunate in the artist who made the head now in Copenhagen. The hair is stately, the bent Roman nose smacks of character, the eyes are thoughtful and tender, the lips pretty but firm. This is the woman who stood quietly behind Augustus's throne, overthrew all her rivals and enemies, and mastered everybody but her son. Tiberius, too, fared well. Idealized though it is, the seated figure in the Lateran Museum is a chef-d'oeuvre worthy of the hand that carved the diorite Khephren in Cairo. Claudius was not so lucky. Surely the sculptor was making fun of him, or illustrating Seneca's pumpkinification, when he carved him up as a worried Jupiter, fat and amiable and dumb. Nero tried hard to develop a sense of beauty, but his real passion was for fame and size. He saw no better function for Xenodotus, the Scopas of this age, than to consume his time in making a colossus of Nero as Apollo, 117 feet high. Hadrian had it removed to the foreground of the Flavian amphitheater, which thence derived its name of Colosseum. With the honest Vespasian, sculpture returned to reality. He let himself be represented frankly as a veritable plebeian, with coarse features, wrinkled brow, bald head, and enormous ears. Kinder is the bust in the Thermae, showing a spirit harassed with affairs of state, or the business-like face of the massive head in Naples. Titus comes down to us with a like cubical cranium and homely countenance. It is hard to think of this stout street vendor as the darling of mankind. Domitian had the good sense in the realistic Flavian age to have himself so hated in life that all his images were ordered destroyed after his death. When the artist left the palace and roamed the streets, he could give free play to the Italic imp of humorous truth. Some old man, surely less equipped with wisdom and denarii than the philosopher premier, posed for the disheveled scarecrow once labeled Seneca. Athletes had their muscles immortalized for a moment by famous artists, and gladiators, as statues, found entry into the best homes, from patrician villas to Farnese palaces. The Roman sculptors relented when they handled the figures of women. Now and then they carved an irascible shrew, but they also molded some vestal virgins of a graceful gravity, occasional incarnations of tenderness like the Clytie of the British Museum, and aristocratic ladies as fragilely charming as the dolls of Watteau or Fragonard. They were adept in the portrayal of children, as in the bronze boy of the Metropolitan Museum or the Innocenza of the Capitol line. They could chisel or cast the forms of animals with startling vividness, as in the wolves' heads found at Nemi in 1929, or the prancing horses of St. Mark's. They seldom achieved the smooth perfection of the Periclean schools, but that was because they loved the individual more than the type and relished the life-giving imperfections of the real. With all their limitations, they stand supreme in the history of portrait art. 6. Painting. The ancient visitor would have found painting even more popular than sculpture in Rome's temples and dwellings, porticos and squares. He would have come upon many works of old masters there, Polygnotus, Zeuxis, Apelles, Protogenes, and others, as dear to the opulent empire as the paintings of the Renaissance are to rich America. And he would have seen in greater abundance, through their better preservation, the products of Alexandrian and Roman schools. The art was old in Italy, where every wall craved ornament. Once even Roman nobles had practiced it, but the Hellenistic invasion had made painting Greek and servile, and at last Valerius Maximus marveled that Fabius Pictor should have stooped to paint murals in the Temple of Health. There were exceptions. Toward the end of the Republic, Aurelius made a name for himself by hiring prostitutes to pose for his goddesses. In the time of Augustus, a dumb aristocrat, Quintus Pedius, took up painting because his defect closed most professions to him. And Nero employed for the interior of his golden house one Amulius, who painted with the greatest gravity, always in his toga. But such men were rari nantes in the crowd of Greeks who at Rome and Pompeii and throughout the peninsula made copies or variations of Greek paintings on Greek or Egyptian themes. The art was practically limited to fresco and tempera. In fresco, a freshly plastered wall was painted with water-moistened colors. In tempera, the pigments were mixed with an adhesive sizing and laid upon a dry surface. Portrait painters sometimes employed an encaustic process in which the tints were fused in hot wax. Nero had his picture painted on a canvas 120 feet high, the first known use of this material. Painting, as we have seen, was applied to statues, temples, stage scenery, and great linen pictures intended for exhibition in triumphs or in the forum. But its favored receptacle was the external or internal wall. The Romans seldom placed furniture against a wall or hung pictures there. They preferred to use the entire space for one painting, or for a group of related designs. In this way, the mural became a part of the house, an integral item in the architectural design. The caustic humor of Vesuvius has preserved for us some 3,500 frescoes, more paintings at Pompeii than can be found in all the rest of the classic world. Since Pompeii was a minor town, we may imagine how many such murals brightened the homes and shrines of classic Italy. The best survivors have been removed to the Naples Museum. Even there their lithe grace impresses us, but only the ancients knew them in the full depth of their color and in the architectural framework that gave each picture a function and a place. In the house of the Vetii, the murals have been left in situ. In a dining room, Dionysus surprises the sleeping Ariadne. On the opposite wall, Daedalus displays his wooden cow to Pasiphae. At the farther end, Hermes looks on calmly as Hephaestus fastens Ixion to the torturing wheel. And in another room, a succession of humorous frescoes shows carefree cupids parodying the industries of Pompeii, including the wine business of the Vetii. The bite of time has gnawed into these once brilliant surfaces, but enough remains to shock the visitor into modesty. The figures are almost perfectly drawn, and so colorful with the flesh of life that they can still make the blood stir lustily in living veins. It is by reference to these Pompeian paintings that connoisseurs have tried to understand the nature and classify the periods and styles of pictorial art in ancient Italy. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.